Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
And today we wanted to talk about sin and transgression.
Profound, ancient ideas. Been around a long time.
Yep.
So why don't we start with what our understanding of sin is and how it overlaps with and is different from transgression.
Years ago, someone had let me know that the word sin is also an archery term, that when someone is shooting at a target and they miss the bullseye, that it's recorded in the tally sheet as a sin. So one way that I think about sin is missing the mark of perfection, which then begs a second question of who is determining the bullseye? Who is it, the culture that tells us what we should be shooting for? Is it the individual that has self-determined, what they're shooting for? And on a certain level, anytime we set a goal or a bullseye at a conscious level, and that's thwarted or we fail it, there's a reaction inside of us, a change in our self-esteem or self-confidence. Even if missing the bullseye was good for us, perhaps ultimately, that something better came out of it, but not being able to chart our own course to the bullseye is a painful thing.
I can see a difference. I'm thinking about this missing the mark of that if a student wants to get good grades in college, let's say, and really gets a terrible failing grade in something impossible like organic chemistry, for example, then that person has missed the mark. Is that the same kind of sin in colloquial usage as someone who tells a falsehood, for example, and knows that that is not the right thing to do and feels guilty about having said something that is untrue?
Well, I think the commonality in both of those scenarios is you've fallen short of collective expectations.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it depends on how deeply ingrained the bullseye is. So for instance, if we do something even a little more provocative, let's say we're raised in a culture where there is a strong admonition that sex should only happen on the wedding night. And that's a story and a value that's communicated through the whole developmental period. And then a young person winds up being in college and deciding they're going to experiment sexually outside of marriage, that there's a huge depth of programming inside the kid that is going to be reacting to their decision that they're no longer shooting for this target. While, for instance, it may be that only in college did a kid decide that getting good grades was important, that it isn't integrated into their psychological system, that it's a brand new idea. So falling short of that goal seems less impactful. Less of the psyche reacts. It's not as woven into the personality.
I don't think all sin is simply about cultural norms, however. I mean, certainly we do learn that stealing things or telling falsehoods is the wrong thing to do. But I think there's also an internal standard, not just an external culturally imposed standard for what is the right thing and how we can fall short. I mean, our own conscience can bother us if we've done something that violates a principle. That we get it through culture, but it's not only culture.
No, it's not only culture because these are the principles to which one has to adhere to have a social contract that works. I mean, if you're constantly lying and stealing, it may serve you well for a while, but it likely you will eventually get into trouble.
And there, something like the 10 Commandments of here's what you cannot do and here's what you really should do. How do you live your life? Just what you've said, Lisa. How do things need to work?
Well, but this idea of fear of consequences, that has to do with the development of foresight and having information about the environment. In some of the work with sociopaths, that even if a sociopath has no developed empathy for another person, they can be worked with in terms of helping them socialize just through a fear of consequences for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a way in which people can follow the rules and fear breaking the rules. But I think what you're talking about, or what you might be pointing to, is the idea that there is something in the self that responds to sin, or I would say actually more transgression. And I think that has something to do with empathy. That morality is a natural development of empathy. If, as a child grows, they cause pain to another living thing, and they experience discomfort or pain in the observation of that, that creates an aversive feedback loop. So they would naturally not want to repeat that if they have an empathic pain in response. So I think there is a natural morality if the self and the ego are in dialogue with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what you're pointing to.
Yeah, I agree. There's a natural morality. There was some experiment that I read about with babies where some babies are given one reward and others are given a lesser reward. And that even in year-old babies, they can tell the difference. With their little brows get kind of furrowed of, this doesn't make sense, something's wrong here.
They've done similar experiments with, I think it was orangutans, where there was some kind of great ape where the one got the better reward, and there's like an innate sense of fairness.
I think I know what you're talking about, in that when one of the apes saw that the other ape got a better reward, they were less satisfied with their own reward.
Yeah.
So this capacity to compare in a certain way. But the idea of sin and transgression, so just defining that a bit, so sin could be missing the mark of perfection, and transgression, and the etymology of that word being to cross, to go across.
To step across.
To step across. And this idea of an accepted boundary, in order to step across, one would have to know there is a boundary. And that one is moved through that boundary.
I mean, I think transgression could possibly be unconscious. I think it could be either conscious or unconscious. You might not know that you stepped across a boundary.
Oh, I think we see that all the time. And that's a developmental process. Children are constantly experimenting with boundaries and then
It's like
getting
that's
feedback.
how you know where the boundary is in some sense.
Yeah.
But what about sin and transgression? And, we're used to thinking about those as bad things. And could they ever be in the service of growth and individuation?
Yes, they can be. And that's where things start to get sticky. Wouldn't it be simple if we could just say, sin and transgression are bad, now stop doing that? But there are all kinds of examples of transgressions being in the service of psychic growth, of a greater truth, of something that is deeply meaningful.
Is that I think sin and transgression is an internal marker. And although I think we have some difference of opinion about how much cultural program, which really goes to Freud's idea of the superego, how much cultural programming goes into sin and transgression, I do think most of the sins and transgressions that lead to growth are violations of cultural norms that are somehow suffocating the individuality of the person.
So, do you want to give an example?
Sure. Being the first kid in a family to go to college and feeling uncomfortable about asking your parents to help you pay for it, or feeling a certain amount of negative feedback from the larger family.
Or even just feeling guilty.
Or feeling guilty about it. I don't think that's uncommon at all in some families.
Well, what about something that's even more a little bit more sinful than being the first person to go to college? Could something like having an affair ever be in the service of growth?
What do you think?
I mean, I think it can be. And I think obviously we're in really sticky territory here because it's, because you could listen to this podcast and think that you have a license to transgress all kinds of norms because it means you're individuating. And then that's clearly not connected with a deeply felt sense of ethics, right? This brings into the discussion the idea of careful discernment. and trying to hold it all consciously and suffering it. Because I think that if we're, something like an affair, for example, let's say that you're married and you're unhappy in your marriage and you've fallen in love with someone outside the marriage. Deciding what to do about that will require suffering. You'll have to suffer sacrifice in one way or another. And to sort of say, well, this is all fine because it means I'm growing, then it's not, it's not ethical then. And, but to hold it consciously with this idea that you are going to suffer the consequences no matter what they are, then it can be an experience of growth.
So we're talking about affairs and perhaps looking to somehow explain how, at least in our culture, having an affair or somebody having sex outside of a marital agreement can sometimes be an act of individuation and can lead to substantial growth and be, yes, in a sense, worth the suffering.
Yeah, I want to be careful to say that, it's not like it's okay. And it's not like it's not destructive, let's say, to have the affair.
Yes, there are costs that are real.
Very real.
It has to do with one way or another, there will be a price to be paid. One way or another, there will be a regret. The regret that I have cheated on my partner, if it were me, or the regret that I stayed with my partner. And that does bring in the idea of discernment.
Yeah, you have to be able to bear the disruption and disorientation that the transgression will bring. One of the things that Jim Hollis says. Jim Hollis is a Jungian analyst, and he says, in times like this, you can ask yourself, will this make my life bigger or will it make my life smaller? And, that's a very, very difficult question to answer honestly.
But that kind of forecasting, I think, evokes a higher level of awareness. Because I think when we're in the grip of powerful forces, that it is difficult for us to forecast or difficult for us to really face consequences.
Well, and I think if you're swept away with, strong sexual attraction or something, you're probably not, it's probably very difficult to have a clear sense of discernment. But, I think you can get a sense of, are you moving towards something larger? Or is it a lark that gratifies something more like the ego?
Are you having your feelings or are your feelings having you? Being swept away by passion.
Yeah, in some sense, it's almost like what's harder, Like in some sense, you should do the harder thing.
What would you imagine that could be?
Well, okay, so let's say that you're contemplating having an affair.
Okay.
And that in some sense, that if you were to be with this person, say you wanted to leave your partner, that you might have a richer, fuller life. You might experience a side of yourself you hadn't experienced before. But it would require, say, a sacrifice of the image of yourself as a good person. And it would disrupt things that have been very, very comfortable. And it would require being able to admit to yourself that you didn't really know who you were. And you would have to bear other people's disappointment.
And you would have to bear the injury to your spouse.
Yes.
Which one can reasonably imagine would be
tremendous.
Yes. A real choice to inflict that injury and judgment and looking like a bad person.
So to bear that feeling that one has sinned and to somehow hold that as you move forward into what you hope will be that bigger life, which will include an acknowledgement of one's sinfulness.
Yeah.
You see, there's this there. And I think this is where we're getting to archetypally is, moving through life with the fantasy that one is sinless.
Yes.
And then continuing to move through life, acknowledging that one has sinned. And to be able to forge a life by the sweat of your brow, in that more human, more humble place, more pained place.
Well, part of what we're talking about now is that you will have admitted and really owned up to your shadow. That is one thing that sin and transgression will invite you to do if you do it consciously. Is, well, look at that. I have a shadow. And, Jung says something, I wish I could quote this perfectly, but, it's like once we know we have a shadow, it gives us gravitas. It gives us depth and dimensionality. And, at a pretty high cost, because, we can't kind of be in this innocence complex.
And I'm thinking about people who have transgressed in ways that we now consider heroic, people that took a stand against some social wrong at a time when it was perceived as a norm in society.
Do you have a specific example you're thinking of?
I'm thinking about the civil rights movement, for example, of people standing up, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated for transgressing what a lot of social norms considered an appropriate place for African Americans to occupy in society. Don't rock the boat.
I was similarly thinking of just the suffragette movement and the way women were assaulted for standing up and crying out for the right to vote, and the incredible hatred that was delivered to the suffragettes. Yeah. And the idea that this is sinful for them to step out of their place in the culture.
See, I'm thinking that these are examples of transgression, and that transgression has to do with collective or social, cultural norms around what's the appropriate role for women, what's the appropriate role for African Americans, what's the appropriate role if you are part of this religion with thus and such a moral code. But that sin is...
has a uniquely religious quality to it also. Yeah.
It has a more internal sense of innate rightness, that it's a little more archetypal, a little more, it is wrong on a different level. And I think they overlap. I think it's like a Venn diagram of two circles overlapping, but they're not quite the same thing. And that sin may be, I'm kind of just trying this out, is when I miss the mark of my own internal standard. I do something that is not just a cultural wrong norm, but something that I hold dear, and I have really done something that by my own standard of principle I know to be wrong.
Absolutely. And there's a level of pain and self-confrontation and suffering that realization brings.
Yeah, it's not in the interest of my own growth. I did it because I was in the grip of a complex or passion, or I was too weak or too greedy or too tired or too anything, and I simply gave in to something that is, I cannot justify, and it's not justifiable. I should not have spanked my child, for example. I lost, let's say, and every mother probably knows this one, of I gave way to strong feelings of exasperation and frustration, and I hit my child.
Or screamed at them even.
Or screamed at them in a really destructive, angry, witch-like way.
So let's just take that for a second, because we wouldn't say in that instance that the act of screaming at your child was in and of itself something that led to a new, larger life. However, if you take that experience in and you really take responsibility for it and get curious about it, you will feel humbled.
Yes.
And you may have a deepened sense of your own capacity for, let's call it, evil. And that could bring about a kind of growth, an awareness of one's capacity, an awareness of one's shadow.
Which may not necessarily change the feeling of remorse. There may always be a feeling that one wishes one didn't do that, but one can still make use of it in a way that enlarges the self.
So when we miss the mark, hopefully, we learn from it and we try to become better marksmen.
So that makes me think a little bit about the developmental process of transgression and sin, we might say, that's natural in our own development as children, and testing limits and putting ourselves at odds strongly with our parents or with the culture for no other reason than the experience of being at odds. That it's not even because as teenagers were championing a high ideal, but just basically flipping off authority structures in a way that we might regret or find humorous later on in life. But there is another experience that we have of standing against that somehow is valuable in ego development, regardless of the particular, gesture.
Yeah, so maybe we're talking about sort of three kinds of things then. The sort of stepping over or transgression that leads to a larger life because of what it is you're doing, like the person who goes to college or gets a PhD or whatever. A kind of a sin, perhaps, that enlarges the personality, not because the gesture itself led anywhere, but because of the self-knowledge that it brings. And then the way that standing against something, like you're talking about, Joseph, kind of brings a kind of ego development and sort of being transgressive to just sort of flip someone off.
Right. That there is a more perhaps clear sense of being an individual and having the power to disagree. Or the power to chart a new course, even if it's not a great course.
Yeah.
But it's a new course.
Right. Your own course.
Your own course.
It's very much like learning to walk. That, teenagers are famous for this. That you have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet in a more symbolic way. And not just do what mom says and do what dad says and follow the rules and get all your homework in on time and so on and so forth. Of how else does one develop a kind of psychological sturdiness? You're going to, just like an infant learning to walk is going to fall.
Yeah, I would really prefer that my teenagers just do what I tell them to do.
I remember my teenagers, and they did stuff that I didn't know about until 15 years later, and it was I was shocked and also kind of glad that I really didn't know, as vigilant as I thought I was. But they learned to stand on their own 2 psychic feet and make some mistakes, and I hope learn from them.
I want to talk about true and false resolution of sin and transgression.
Okay, that's a great topic.
Because we've hinted at this idea that we might have some kind of a resolution or a reparative process through understanding our transgressions, our sins, understanding the root of aspects of our personality that we have disavowed in some fashion. But I think there is a tremendously damaging and nefarious aspect of the culture around the false resolution of sin. So, for instance, if someone were simply to declare that they had been religiously forgiven and that somehow no self-knowledge had been gained, but it had just been magically lifted off them and put them back into a naive, like self-righteous
status
opinion.
Quo ante or something, or what Jung called the regressive restoration of the persona. And it is, it's interesting because sometimes I think about Catholic confession, because honestly, what we do as analysts is not so dissimilar from confession. People come into our offices and they say things they would never tell anyone else, and that gives them relief. But the question is, and then what happens? Is it over at that point? I mean, one of the things that's sort of meaningful about the Catholic confession is you have to do things to atone. You have to integrate the experience somehow and do what you can to transform it rather than just sort of being wiped clean. So I think you have to suffer your guilt. And I think that suffering guilt can be transformative.
Yes, absolutely. I think Jung was clear about it, and I think mystics of all ages have been clear about it, that without suffering, the personality doesn't undergo the kind of heat that's required for a new attitude to actually emerge.
Yeah.
Well, suffering, hopefully, will elevate and grow more consciousness. Pain is somewhat unconscious, but the suffering is the guilt, is the remorse, are the feelings about it, the meaning that I make of it. What happened to me? Why did I do that? I feel awful about it. And I have to explore and kind of reflect on myself of what is going on inside me that I did the thing I really didn't intend to do and don't want to do.
And I think a key attitude here is, again, curiosity, because I think if we're just self-flagellating, that can be sort of a defense against really experiencing it. It's sort of like you just kind of keep on lashing yourself with your lash or something, and it becomes a way of not really dealing with what you did, because you could, it's like the person who apologizes again and again and again, and you feel like, yeah, but it's not, but let's really deal with what happened,
A true kind of restoration.
Yeah.
When I think about false resolutions, and I think we can see this in some of the fundamentalist religious environments, where a false resolution of sin often leads to kind of scapegoating, that the problem is projected onto other people, and then this great vengeance is wreaked upon other people who are perceived to have this sin. And we're seeing this right now in various legislative bodies, that some of the most aggressive legislation is being introduced by delegates and other leaders who actually have secretly been perpetrating these problems. So this idea of attacking other people as a way of resolving one's own sin, and I think that's the natural outcome of people magically thinking they have resolved something, but having not really been changed or really having dealt with it.
Having really integrated their own sense of sin.
And having suffered it in order to increase consciousness. It's simply a way of, the other is projecting it out onto something else. It's not me, it's them, whoever the them happens to be. And I have therefore just gotten rid of it.
And this process of projecting sin and then destroying the object is ancient. I mean, animal sacrifice was a big business in the ancient world. It was constantly being done. So people were constantly putting their sin into some creature and being sacrificed by the priests.
And we have different mechanisms these days, but we're still doing the same thing.
We're still doing it. And the reason people do it is because it does give them a sense of temporary relief. So I think this topic of sin and transgression is deep, it's profound. I think it deserves a lot of attention.
Yeah.
So shall we transition to a dream that has been sent in this week?
Absolutely. We have a female dreamer who's 48 years old, and she has sent us a dream she'd like us to talk about. I am outside in the yard of an old but well-maintained house. The house is off-white, but I couldn't say if it was gray off-white or beige off-white. There are other people here, but I don't pay them much attention because I'm looking at my left hand. It has been injured. The skin across my knuckles has been torn and crudely stitched up. The skin is buckled between stitches, and several are infected. I think to myself, no wonder things are a mess.
Well, I think the very first sentence says a lot. Right there, I am outside. So I might think about what's she outside of in the yard of an old but well-maintained house. And so that calls into my mind of what kind of psychic structure is she living outside of? And what does that mean? It's old and well-maintained? Is it something that's been outgrown, perhaps? Same old, same old?
I don't know exactly why my intuition is going here, but I'm sort of thinking of like the family home. Like this might be an image of the family complex or the family structure, perhaps because it's an old house. But, sort of like, it's been around for a while and it's still kind of going strong.
And by family complex, we might mean the general attitudes, the schema, the general expected patterns of interaction, religious, social beliefs, socioeconomic standards that are all built up and maintained in a family, in most all of our families. And this is well maintained. Mm-hmm. So it's not just a set of these values, but the values are actively reinforced.
Yes.
And the dreamer is already outside.
So there's some perspective, there's some capacity to look at what these are without being all surrounded by it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the other thing that really jumps out to me about the dream is that this injury, which sounds like a pretty bad injury, and a messy, haphazard repair of the injury, which itself, I just can't help but imagine sounds traumatic, has happened without her knowing about it. And now she's just looking at the damage. There isn't a memory of the wound. There's not a memory of the repair or the being stitched up. She's just looking at the damage. So something has happened, and she's only just becoming aware of it now.
So I certainly can imagine that we can feel hidden wounds in the soul that we only at a later time can connect with, but also that there can be hidden attempts at repair. Mm-hmm. That the soul also has self-reparative impulses, but even the soul's ability to repair itself is not enough, that it needs some additional attention or the conscious attitude.
Yeah, I mean, what I think about is that maybe there's some feeling that's been split off. Mm-hmm. That's the sense that I have.
So let's try to tie together a relationship between the split off feeling and the symbol of the wound in the hand. How could we understand that?
Well, I think I get there because there's not this memory of this wound that has caused the pain. It's like you're sort of almost watching it from a distance, right? Oh my God, how did that get there? It's almost like you woke up and you're like, wow, I have this terrible wound on my hand. How did we have no idea how it got there? That's where I'm getting this idea of almost sort of something that's been split off. That this knowledge of this wound maybe was too great to bear, and so it's been split off. And of course, it's on the back of the left hand. What about that?
Across the knuckles. And how would an injury across the knuckles take place? So from some kind of conflict, some kind of hitting of the knuckles. Mm-hmm. And what's a hand? Of all those expressions that we use of how hand means agency and hand means what we can do. Hand is often associated with our ego intentions of I do things with my hands.
Yes, and this is the left hand. So is this something that's a little bit in the unconscious, a little bit in shadow? That expression, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So is this the aspect of agency that is not quite conscious, that has been perhaps aggressive and been wounded in that aggression?
I think that's a very important piece to bring up. I would want to know from the dreamer whether they are right or left hand dominant.
Yes.
Because that would be so informative. But let's assume that, like most people, that the dreamer is right-handed. But this idea of that she has been wounded by her own aggression without realizing it, I think that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, it says, the context for this dream, the dreamer says, there was a situation with a female family member where I pondered walking away or at least putting more distance between us. So there may have been there obviously was some conflict. There was some conflict, it appears.
Yes, and it was apparently so upsetting to the dreamer that she was contemplating terminating the relationship in some fashion, that it's that deep a concern. So then we can look at the wound of the hand and the conscious mind, even the ego, trying to discern the severity of the wound, and admitting the infection and admitting how crudely it had been sewn up together, that it requires a response of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's infected.
Yeah.
This is not good.
It's festering.
Still, there's something right. It's been really crudely stitched up.
The other thing that I think about with the hand is in terms of how the wound and the festering is, it'd be very unlikely for her to be able to take those stitches out and clean it up herself. Mm-hmm. That it's going to require her going somewhere metaphorically and asking for help.
Yeah.
So it brings up the idea of what is a repair.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a big question of between two people or between the person and herself, of what constitutes a real repair of something that has been crudely repaired and is now infected versus something that is really going to be repaired.
If we were to think about it analytically, there's something I think of very apt in the image, and not unlike what we might have to do or facilitate in a session, which is to take out stitches that we might have to return or help a client return to a wound, take out the stitches which will open a wound, to allow the infection to be managed and the necrotic tissue to somehow be addressed. And that's a sober decision for an individual to make, and certainly a sober decision for us sitting in the analytic seat to decide that we'll lean into.
So if I had to hazard a guess about what was going on for this dreamer, I would say maybe it's possible that this family conflict did more damage than she knew, that maybe she wasn't really looking at it and wasn't aware of how painful and damaging it was. And now she's aware of that. And that whatever attempts at a repair were made were not enough. And in fact, as you said, that great word, it's festering. And so there's going to have to be a lot more work done.
Absolutely. And in the comment where she's deciding whether or not she should walk away, I would lean into the idea that she probably shouldn't walk away because it will take another person to take those stitches out and clean out that wound, that it's not a one-woman job.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.